Imagine for a moment, you're standing in your living room. Let's say it's 1955. You've got one of those big wooden console radios in the corner. You tune the dial, you're searching through the static for a signal, you hear the local news, maybe a baseball game, some jazz. But there is one specific frequency, one particular voice that you are legally forbidden from hearing.
It really does sound like the opening of a dystopian novel, doesn't it? Like something from a society that's been partitioned, where information is controlled.
Exactly. But you're saying that this isn't fiction.
No, not at all. You're describing the reality in the United States for the better part of a century.
I am. I'm talking about an invisible wall. Not a physical wall you can see or touch, but a legal wall built out of statutes and regulations. And this wall stood for over 60 years right here in the U.S., separating the federal government from you, the American taxpayer.
It is one of the most fascinating and, frankly, bizarre chapters in American legal history. For decades, it was technically illegal for the U.S. State Department to broadcast its own foreign news services, huge operations like the Voice of America, directly to American citizens living inside the United States.
And when you say it out loud like that, it just sounds almost conspiratorial.
Yeah.
The government was producing thousands upon thousands of hours of radio, TV, films, magazines.
A huge media operation.
A huge media operation.
Yeah.
And if you lived in Des Moines or Dallas, that stuff was treated almost like contraband. You just weren't supposed to see it. It was stamped for export only.
Which is so counterintuitive. Usually when we think of government media and authoritarianism, we think of the opposite problem.
Right. You think of a regime that's desperate to force its state media onto the population. Here is the leader. Listen to him for 5 hours straight.
Exactly. But in the U.S., this invisible wall was built on a very specific, and I'd say very American, fear, the fear that a government with a megaphone turned inward inevitably becomes a propaganda machine.
And that is the perfect entry point. That brings us to our topic for today. We're doing a deep dive into the evolution of a law called the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948.
Now, I know that name, Smith-Mundt Act, sounds like a dusky law firm or maybe a failed folk duo from the 70s.
Yes, it does.
But stick with us, because this story is a wild ride. It goes from the paranoid, smoke-filled rooms of the early Cold War right through the explosion of the internet and all the way to a massive controversy in 2013 that finally, officially tore that wall down.
And it doesn't even stop there. It brings us right up to the present day. We have documents on the stack here from just a few months ago, October 2025, detailing a major legislative push by Representative Thomas Massie to rebuild that very same wall.
He's explicitly calling for a reinstatement of the ban on domestic propaganda. So this is not a settled issue. It's very much alive.
It's an incredible story. So today, we're going to cover the apple pie propaganda of the 40s and 50s. Then we'll get into the modernization of 2013 that critics called Orwellian. And then we'll land on the current battle over what Representative Massie is calling, and this is a direct quote, taxpayer-funded fake news.
And I think the mission for this deep dive really is to grapple with this fundamental tension that exists in any democracy. On one side, you have the principle of transparency.
The idea that you have a right to know what your government is saying abroad in your name with your tax dollars.
Precisely. But on the other side, you have the very real danger of domestic propaganda, the government using those same tax dollars to try and shape your opinion, to manipulate you.
And as we're about to see, drawing a clean line between informing the public and brainwashing the public is a lot harder and a lot messier than it looks.
It is. So let's get into it. To understand the wall, we really have to look at the foundation. We have to go back in time to the immediate aftermath of World War II. The world's in ruins, the old empires are crumbling, maps are being redrawn.
And a new kind of war is just beginning.
The information war, we're in the late 1940s.
Okay, so what's the context here?
Well, during the war, President Roosevelt had realized pretty early on that bullets and bombs alone wouldn't be enough to win. He had to control the narrative. So he consolidated a bunch of agencies into the Office of War Information, the OWI.
This is the source of all that iconic WWII poster art, right? Loose lips, sink ships, and Rosie the Riveter.
That's the one. It was a centralized, massive propaganda machine. Its job was to counter Axis messaging, Nazi and Japanese propaganda, and to boost morale, both on the home front and for our allies abroad.
And by all accounts, it was incredibly effective.
Very effective. It rallied the country. But the moment the war ended in 1945, there was this immediate, intense anxiety in Congress and really among the American public as a whole. They looked at what the OWI had become, how effectively it had managed and shaped information.
And then they looked across the ocean.
And they looked over at the Soviet Union and what was left of Nazi Germany. They saw the Ministry of Truth in action.
They saw what happens when the state has total control over the media.
Exactly. They saw how a state-controlled media apparatus could essentially delete reality and replace it with whatever the dictator wanted it to be that day. And there was this genuine, palpable fear that if the U.S. maintained a standing information agency during peacetime, it could be co-opted by whichever administration was in power to manipulate voters.
I mean, just imagine. Imagine if the sitting president could legally direct a massive broadcasting network to tell Americans how wonderful his policies are 24/7.
And using their own tax money to do it.
It's a massive incumbent advantage, to put it mildly. The whole idea of the government owning the news just didn't sit right with the American experiment.
It was a visceral feeling. Our sources say the public had an intense dislike of government propaganda operations. So as soon as the war was over, the OWI was dissolved, gone.
But then reality sets in.
We are tumbling headfirst into the Cold War. The Soviet Union is just blasting anti-American propaganda all over a devastated Europe, across Asia, into South America. They're telling the world that capitalism is evil, that America is a racist, imperialist power.
So we couldn't just stay silent. We had to push back to tell the American story to counter the Soviet narrative.
That was the dilemma. We needed a megaphone pointed outward, but we were terrified of it being pointed inward. And that's where our two architects come into the picture. Representative Carl E. Mundt of South Dakota.
A Republican.
And Senator H. Alexander Smith of New Jersey.
Also a Republican.
Also a Republican, which is an interesting detail. In 1948, they introduced the bill that would eventually become the Information and Educational Exchange Act, Public Law 8402.
This is the Smith-Mundt Act.
This is it. And its stated purpose was, on the surface, very noble. It was to promote a better understanding of the United States and other countries. It was designed to give legal authority to things like the Voice of America so they could broadcast overseas.
Okay, so the official mission is tell the truth about America to the rest of the world. Seems pretty harmless.
It does. But Congress at the time did not trust the State Department to handle it. You have to remember the atmosphere in 1948. We are right on the cusp of the McCarthy era.
The Red Scare.
The Red Scare. There were widespread accusations of communist sympathizers being embedded in the State Department. And there was also this fear among conservatives of New Deal propagandists still lurking in the bureaucracy who might use these new tools to push a domestic social agenda.
So they felt they had to put a very tight leash on it.
An incredibly tight leash. And here's a detail from one of our sources, a note from the Northwestern University Law Review that just blew my mind. The screening process for the people being hired to work on these broadcasts, the background checks, the security clearance, was described as being more stringent than the clearance for people working on the atomic bomb project.
Wait, get out of here. Seriously. Let that sink in. They were more worried about a rogue radio host in a studio than they were about a rogue nuclear physicist with access to the bomb.
In a way, yes. Because they understood that information is power. If you control the story, you can control the culture, you can control the country. And because of this deep-seated suspicion, the original 1948 Act created what legal scholars now call a de facto ban.
De facto meaning in effect, but not explicitly written down.
Exactly. The law didn't have a line in it that said, "Do not show to Americans," in big red letters. Not yet. But what it did was restrict access so heavily that it functioned that way. The materials were only available for examination by members of the press or members of Congress, and only under very specific circumstances.
So you, the average citizen in Chicago, couldn't just write a letter and ask to hear a broadcast.
No chance. It was like a secret menu for government news, and you had to be a congressman to order off of it.
And this suspicion, this fear, it didn't just fade away after 1948.
No, it hardened. It became institutionalized. By the time we get to 1972, the Cold War is in a very different phase. We're in the midst of the Vietnam War. And a major figure in foreign relations, Senator J. William Fulbright, enters the picture.
And what was his take on all this?
Fulbright was arguably quite cynical about these propaganda efforts by the 70s. He famously argued that these broadcasting efforts belonged in the graveyard of Cold War relics.
Wow. So he didn't just want to restrict them. He thought they were obsolete.
Or perhaps even dangerous in their own way. So in 1972, as part of the Foreign Relations Authorization Act, he pushed through an amendment that changed the language of Smith-Mundt. And this is a critical moment. It went from a de facto ban
to a de jure ban, an official legal ban.
That's it. The law now explicitly stated that these materials shall not be disseminated within the United States.
Shall not. That's about as clear as legal language gets. It's not should not, or it is advised not to. It's a command. Don't do it.
Full stop. And it got even tighter in 1985. Another senator, Edward Zirinsky of Nebraska, made a really famous comparison on the Senate floor. He said that if the United States Information Agency, or USIA, which was the parent agency at the time, if it were allowed to broadcast its programs domestically,
What would happen?
it would be no different than a Soviet propaganda organ.
A Soviet organ. That is some incredibly strong language to use against your own government's information agency.
It is, but it perfectly reflects what was called the leakage fear.
The leakage fear. Explain that.
It was this dual-headed fear. First, private broadcasters were terrified. They were worried that if this government-funded, tax-subsidized content leaked into the domestic market, it would crowd them out. How could a local radio station compete with a global news agency with essentially unlimited resources?
Right. It would just blow them out of the water.
And the second part of the fear, the political part, was that it would be used to manipulate the electorate, that it would blur the line between information and political campaigning.
So the wall was cemented. For decades, if the Voice of America produced a beautiful documentary about, say, American jazz music,
A listener in Paris could hear it.
but a jazz fan in New Orleans could not.
Correct. In fact, there's a famous case that illustrates this perfectly. It was a film about JFK called Years of Lightning, Day of Drums. It was produced by the USIA right after his assassination.
I think I've heard of this.
By all accounts, it was a masterpiece. Incredibly emotional, beautifully shot, a powerful tribute. But because it was government-produced for foreign audiences, it was illegal to show it in American theaters.
So what happened?
Congress had to pass a special one-time resolution just to allow Americans to see this one film about their own slain president. That is how strict this wall was.
Okay, so we've established the wall. It's high, it's thick, it's made of solid legal brick. But then technology happens.
The 21st century happens, the internet happens.
And I'm guessing the internet doesn't really care about the borders defined in the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948.
Not in the slightest. By the late 90s and early 2000s, you have this completely bizarre and unenforceable situation. The Voice of America posts an article or an audio clip on their website, intending it for a listener in Cairo.
But a person in Chicago can just type in the URL and see the exact same thing.
Instantly. There is no way to stop a radio wave or a data packet at the border anymore. The entire concept of a geographic ban, which was the foundation of the law, became physically impossible to enforce.
The wall became a screen door.
A screen door with no screen. And this technological reality check is what really kicked off the movement for modernization. It started to pick up steam around 2010, 2012, led by two representatives, Mac Thornberry,
Republican from Texas,
and Adam Smith,
a Democrat from Washington.
a Democrat. So you had bipartisan support, which tells you how much the technological argument was resonating.
So what was their case? What were the main arguments for tearing down this 60-year-old wall?
There were really three main pillars to their argument. The first and most obvious was modernization. They just argued that the ban was anachronistic. It was a dinosaur law from the analog age trying to function in a digital world, and it just wasn't working.
Okay, that's the practical argument. What was the second?
The second was a principled argument about transparency.
The idea that we should be able to see what we're paying for.
Exactly. The proponents of repeal started asking, how can you possibly hold the State Department accountable for its messaging if you're not even allowed to see what that messaging is? If they're saying things abroad in our name that are inaccurate or foolish or even damaging, shouldn't American taxpayers and journalists be able to see that and call them out on it?
That's a powerful argument. It's the whole sunlight is the best disinfectant idea.
Yeah.
You can't have oversight of something that's kept in a black box.
Right. And there was a third argument, which was more strategic. It was about countering foreign disinformation. The argument went like this. You have large diaspora communities living inside the United States, say Somali Americans in Minneapolis or Russian Americans in Brooklyn. They might be consuming a steady diet of anti-American propaganda from state-run media back in their home countries simply because that's what's available in their native language.
So the idea was, let's make sure they can hear the U.S. side of the story, too.
Yeah.
Let's give them an alternative, even if they're living on U.S. soil.
Correct. Let's allow Voice of America's Somali service to be accessible in Minneapolis. So you take all these arguments together, the practical, the principled, and the strategic, and they culminated in the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2012.
And to make sure it passed, they didn't run it as a standalone bill.
No, they used a classic legislative tactic. It was folded into the massive must-pass National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, for fiscal year 2013.
The NDAA, that's the giant bill that funds the entire military every single year. Things get tucked into that bill because no one wants to be seen voting against funding the troops.
Precisely. It's a vehicle for all sorts of provisions. And President Obama signed that NDAA into law on January 2nd, 2013.
And just like that, boom, the wall comes down.
Well, the wall was reconfigured. It wasn't just dynamited. The key changes were very significant. First, it officially removed the ban on domestic dissemination.
The shall not be disseminated clause was struck.
It was. Second, it allowed the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which, by the way, is now called the USAGM, the U.S. Agency for Global Media, to make its materials available to domestic audiences, including U.S. media outlets, researchers, and the general public, but upon request.
Upon request. That phrase sounds innocent enough.
Huh.
But this is where the story gets really interesting and where the controversy truly ignites, because the law didn't just say, okay, Americans can now go look at the VOA website if they want. It opened the door for this content to be actively pushed into the American media ecosystem.
It did, and this leads us directly to what I call the influence prohibition paradox.
Okay, let's unpack that paradox. That sounds complicated.
It's a bit of a legal pretzel. So the modernized law, the new version, still contains a line that says federal funds cannot be used to influence public opinion in the United States.
Okay, so that sounds like the old protection is still there. They can't try to propagandize us.
On the surface, yes, but, and this is the crucial part that legal scholars immediately pointed out, the law then creates these massive carve-outs and exceptions. For instance, the new law specifically says that simply providing information about government programs or making materials available to the public does not count as influence under the new definition.
Wait, hold on a second. Let me be sure I understand that. If you are a government agency and you produce a news story,
right,
and you broadcast that news story to people, telling them about your policies or about world events from your perspective, how is that not an attempt to influence their opinion? Isn't that the entire point of news and information?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question, and that is exactly where the critics of this law pounce. Let's say the State Department produces a really slick, high production value video piece about a new climate change policy. It's intended officially for an audience in Germany, but then under the new law, they make it available to a U.S. cable news network, and that network, maybe because their budget is tight that week, decides to run the segment.
Then the American public is sitting on their couches watching a government-produced narrative about a government policy presented as if it's just regular news.
Precisely. And the government can turn around and say, we didn't violate the law. We didn't target Americans. We just made the material available as the act allows. It completely dissolves the line of intent.
So let's really dig into the consequences of this 2013 change. The sources seem to break it down into the good and the bad. Let's start with the good. The primary argument was transparency.
Yes. And on that front, academics and legal scholars, for the most part, cheered this change. For the first time, independent analysts could actually see what their tax dollars were being spent on in the realm of foreign messaging.
So a journalist or a researcher in 2014 could, file a request and get a transcript of a Voice of America broadcast to Iran and see if it was accurate.
Yes, exactly. Or they could analyze the entire output of Radio Free Asia and see if it had a particular political bias. It ended what was effectively a form of censorship that prevented Americans from reviewing their own government's work. It allowed for actual oversight.
So that's the good. Access, accountability, transparency. But then we have the bad. The fear of, as Massie puts it, taxpayer-funded fake news.
And this fear centers on a few key problems.
Yep.
The first is what our sources call the attribution problem.
Meaning, who made this content? Where did it come from?
Exactly. One of our sources, a legal analysis from Northwestern, points out a critical flaw in the 2013 law. While the government can provide its content to private U.S. broadcasters, there is no strict binding requirement that those private stations must clearly and conspicuously label the content as being government-produced when they rebroadcast it.
So let me play this out. I could be watching my local evening news or just scrolling through a news aggregator on my phone, and I see a segment. Looks like journalism. It sounds like journalism. It has good production values. But it was actually written, shot, and edited by the U.S. State Department. And I might never know.
Theoretically, yes. If a private broadcaster takes that free content and just integrates it into their newscast without slapping a big, obvious, produced by the U.S. government disclaimer on it, the lines get incredibly blurred for the viewer.
And that's what leads directly to the Orwellian concerns that critics raised.
It does. Critics immediately argued that this was a dangerous step toward a state-dominated media environment. Think about the economics of it. The federal government has virtually unlimited resources to produce high-quality video, audio, and written content.
Meanwhile, local news stations across the country are budget-starved, they're laying off reporters, their resources are shrinking.
Right. So what happens? The government shows up and says, hey, here's a perfectly good, professionally produced 3-minute story on international trade. It's free, you can just have it.
The station managers can be tempted to take it. It's free content, it looks good, it fills a slot in the broadcast, let's run it.
Exactly. It's cheap, easy content for the station, but it's a form of narrative control for the government. And then there's the audience confusion we talked about. The law says the government can't create content for domestic audience. But if they create it for a foreign audience, and it just so happens to be perfectly suited for a domestic audience in an election year,
who's to say what the original intent was?
You could drive a fleet of trucks through that loophole.
Which brings us to the modern day. Or, in our timeline, the very recent past of October 2025, the backlash.
The backlash is very real. After about a decade of this new system being in place, the criticism has solidified into a political movement. On October 8th, 2025, Representative Thomas Massie, a Republican from Kentucky, introduced a bill, H.R. 5704.
Doesn't have a catchy name?
Not particularly. It's called the Repeal the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2013.
Well, that does what it says on the tin, I suppose. Very direct.
Very direct. His main co-lead on the bill is Representative Scott Perry from Pennsylvania. And Massie's motivation is explicit. He put out a press release with the bill, and the central quote is, taxpayer-funded fake news should not be used by the federal government to wage influence campaigns against the American people.
He is not mincing words there. Fake news is obviously a very loaded term.
It's politically charged, absolutely. But in this specific context, he's using it to refer to government-generated content that masquerades as independent journalism. It's worth noting, Massie had actually tried to do this before. He tried to attach this repeal as an amendment to the 2026 NDAA.
I'm trying to reverse the 2013 NDAA with the 2026 NDAA.
Poetic justice, perhaps. But it was blocked in committee, so now he's trying again with this standalone bill.
So what are the specifics of this new bill? Is he just trying to put the old bricks back in the wall, go back to the pre-2013 world?
He wants to do that, yes. The core of the bill is to restore the firewall, to reinstate the prohibition on domestic dissemination. But H.R. 5704 actually goes much further than just turning back the clock. It contains some very modern provisions designed for the internet age.
Okay, like what?
For one, it explicitly prohibits the State Department and the U.S. AGM from creating and operating covert social media accounts, websites, or podcasts for the purpose of targeting Americans.
Covert accounts. So you mean like a Twitter bot or a Facebook page that's called something like True Patriots for a Strong America, but it's actually being run by a staffer at the State Department?
That is exactly what it aims to ban. But here is the detail in the bill that I found really, really fascinating. It's something his team is calling the 20-year rule.
The 20-year rule? What's that?
The bill proposes that any of this propaganda, material, films, broadcasts, articles produced by the government for foreign audiences must be sent to the National Archives, but with a mandatory 20-year delayed public access.
Whoa, so they want to lock it away in a vault for 2 decades.
That's the idea. The logic behind it is to ensure that this material cannot be weaponized in immediate news cycles or election cycles. If you can't access it for 20 years, it can't be used to influence the next election. It becomes a historical artifact, not a piece of current events.
That is a drastic swing back in the other direction from the 2013 transparency argument. That's basically saying transparency is too dangerous. We don't want you to see this until it's ancient history.
It creates a major tension, doesn't it? Massie's argument is that if you allow immediate access, you get manipulation. But the counter-argument is, if you delay access for 20 years, do you lose all accountability? How can we know if the U.S. AGM is wasting billions of dollars now if we can't see the receipts for 2 decades?
That's the fundamental trade-off right there.
The bill also includes a provision for mandatory disclaimers. It says that any material that is eventually released must clearly identify the U.S. government as the source and, crucially, specify the foreign audience it was originally intended for.
So if you did see a piece of content, it would have to have a label that says, this video was produced by the United States government for an audience in Brazil.
Something to that effect, yes, which would, at the very least, solve the attribution problem. You'd know you were watching export-quality news, so to speak.
Right. But this entire push from Massie highlights that this debate isn't happening in a vacuum. It isn't just a dry legal argument anymore. It's a battle over reality itself. And this connects directly to the broader context our source material lays out for us. We have to talk about the industrialization of narrative control.
This is the part of the story where we have to zoom out and realize the government isn't the only shark in the water.
Far from it.
The entire debate over Smith-Mundt is happening inside an information ecosystem that is just flooded with sophisticated influence campaigns from all sides. Our sources point specifically to the explosion of dark money and private influence networks.
And we have some specific names in the source documents here. Arabella Advisors, the 1630 Fund.
Right. These are huge, often left-leaning, nonprofit networks that funnel hundreds of millions of dollars into political causes and messaging campaigns. One of our sources notes that the 1630 Fund alone poured nearly $200 million into the political world in 2022.
And to be fair, you have similar structures on the right, like the American Action Network. Yeah.
Absolutely. This is a bipartisan industry now. But the key tactic is that these networks create what are essentially pop-up front groups. They create organizations with nice-sounding grassroots names, Montanans for Better Schools, or Citizens for a Cleaner Ohio. But the money, the polling, and the messaging are all coming from a centralized hub.
So you have these massive private narrative factories that are just pumping out political ads, social media content, and funding news-like websites.
And then layered on top of that, you have the media landscape itself blurring the lines with political figures. We have to talk about the Netflix connection that's mentioned in the sources.
You're talking about the Obamas. Higher Ground Productions.
Yes. The former president and first lady signed a massive multi-year production deal with Netflix, and they've produced some excellent award-winning documentaries like American Factory and Crip Camp, but they also produce content that is explicitly about government and policy.
There's a show mentioned called The G Word, which is based on a Michael Lewis book. It's literally a series about how the federal government actually works.
Right. And another project about America's national parks. Now, whatever you think about their politics, this represents a fundamental shift. You have a former president and first lady becoming major content creators on the world's biggest entertainment streaming platform.
It's not state media in the legal sense, but you could call it statesman media.
That's a great way to put it. And it contributes to this incredibly dense and confusing environment where the source of information is often hard to trace, or at least hard to separate from a clear political agenda. Now imagine you take that chaotic environment, and then you add the 2013 Smith-Mundt repeal into that mix.
It just becomes an overwhelming amount of noise.
It does. And the critics of the repeal make this exact point. We already have dark money groups trying to manipulate us. We already have media conglomerates and former politicians with clear agendas. Do we also want to give the sitting federal government the legal tools to inject its own narratives directly into that same domestic free-for-all?
It feels like it tilts the playing field.
Okay.
The government has the ultimate deep pockets and the biggest megaphone.
And let's not forget the final piece of this puzzle from our sources, the activists' dilemma. There's some fascinating research showing that when protest movements use extreme actions, blocking highways, shutting down events, it can actually cause a public backlash and make them lose popular support for their cause.
Even if people might have agreed with their goals initially.
Exactly. But think about how that can be exploited in this new information war. If a government, or a dark money group for that matter, wanted to discredit a movement they opposed, they wouldn't necessarily need to argue against their ideas.
They could just amplify the most extreme voices in that movement.
Or highlight the most disruptive actions. Or, to take it a step further, even stage a disruptive action to trigger that predictable public backlash. It's a form of narrative jujitsu.
That is deeply Machiavellian.
It's the nature of modern information warfare. And in that war, for 60 years, the Smith-Mundt Act was the one rule of engagement that said the U.S. government cannot use its heavy artillery on its own territory. With that rule weakened, the entire battlefield has changed.
So after all of this history and all of this legal back and forth, what does this all mean for us? For the listener who's just trying to figure out what's true?
It means that at the end of the day, we have to be incredibly savvy and, frankly, skeptical media consumers. The invisible wall is gone. We are all living in the open field now.
We're living with a transparency trade-off. We gained the right to see the government's documents, but in exchange, we lost our protection from its messaging.
That's a perfect summary. The 2013 Modernization Act chose transparency and acknowledged the reality of the internet. Representative Massie's new bill argues that the risk of manipulation has proven to be too high, and we need to rebuild that wall, even if it's a leaky one in the age of the internet.
It really puts the burden squarely on the shoulders of the individual. When you're scrolling through social media or you're listening to a podcast or watching a documentary on Netflix,
You have to be your own editor. You have to constantly be asking, who paid for this? Who made this? Is this independent thought? Is this a dark money ad that's been packaged to look like a grassroots movement? Or is this a government-produced narrative that's been made available to a domestic media outlet?
it really makes you miss the old days when the biggest thing you had to worry about was a commercial break for soap.
It was certainly a simpler information environment.
So let's leave everyone with a final provocative thought to mull over. We talked about that legal pretzel, the definition of influence. The law says the government can't intend to influence you.
But intent is invisible. You can't prove what was in someone's head.
Exactly. So here's the question. If the government is legally banned from propagandizing you, but it is legally allowed to inform you about its policies using the exact same Hollywood-level production values, the same sophisticated psychological techniques, and the very same content that it uses for psychological operations abroad, is there actually a difference?
And if there isn't, would you even know if you were the target?